Hello and welcome to this video. Within today's video we will go into archetypes and the collective shadow. Specifically going into why certain cultures and people tend to have certain archetypes over others, and what this has to do with our ancestral past. So when it comes to archetypes, they are deeply tied to culture and ancestry, inherited through generations. The archetypes within the collective unconscious are dependent on the specific culture and one's ancestors, as these are inherited, where specific cultural versions are clothed in specific cultural garb, but underneath it, the essence of it goes way back and is tied to one's ancestors. As such, archetypes are not isolated symbols, but are deeply rooted in specific cultural contexts and transmitted through generations. For Indo-European people, this goes back to the Proto-Indo-European culture, and the archetypes prevalent within that Neolithic culture that forms the bedrock of the archetypes within the later Indo-European cultures. Though, on an even bigger scale, this goes all the way back to even earlier times, and as such, all humans share these archetypes and the essence of this pattern. The difference between different cultures, civilizations, and tribes, and what archetypes are more in the focus and what is associated with them, including their mythological narratives, are due to, for instance, cultural, historical, and environmental factors, next to other factors both within the culture and between cultures. So, even though we as humans all share the same archetypes as a whole, such as the mother, father, child, hero, nature-related archetypes, and other archetypes I did not mention here, these are colored by these factors. As such, these factors also cause a particular focus on certain archetypes over other ones, so ones valued and others who are avoided. And through very many generations, this sets up within a particular culture or tribe of people what we could call a specific collective psyche that has its own collective unconscious with specific archetypes more to the forefront, who are deemed more important to that culture over other archetypes that do exist but have less influenced that culture over many generations. The collective unconscious being a reservoir of shared universal experiences and symbols that are inherited across generations, where archetypes are, innate universal symbols or themes present in the collective unconscious, which influence human thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Similarly, we as individuals inherit all archetypes, but due to our own specific ancestral line, this can influence what particular archetypes are more dominant within our psyche versus which ones are less influential. Generally, we tend to have certain inherited dominant archetypes within our psychological makeup, which represent important parts of our authentic self, but also influences of those not directly related by blood but responsible of raising us as children, and also environmental factors including trauma can have an effect on the expression of these archetypes and introduce other archetypes as well, next to potentially creating complexes, this being psychological complexes. So there can be an interplay between factors where, for instance, the warrior archetype becomes repressed through trauma. Let's say a psychological complex associates assertiveness with bad, because in the past we were unfairly punished for it, when we, spoke up about being mistreated, for instance. And then this can lead to a repression of this assertiveness, where another archetype can take on a compensatory role and can become a way of coping with the repression. However, a part of our authentic whole becomes repressed, And especially if this is connected to a more dominant archetype, this can lead to, for instance, depression, where trauma in particular can also imprint certain archetypal patterns more strongly, influencing emotional responses, coping mechanisms, and behavioral tendencies, where it can lead to certain archetypes to become more dominant due to certain traumatic experiences. This becoming a response to the trauma, introducing this archetype and skewing their initial trajectory. Next to the individual, then often also dealing with psychological complexes. In that sense, traumatic experiences can introduce new archetypal patterns as a way of coping or adapting to the challenges presented by the trauma. And these new archetypes, take on compensatory roles or serve as protective mechanisms. And these compensatory roles may become part of the individual psychological landscape or, could be temporary. But, especially if the trauma is long-term, this can really make such introduced archetypes more stronger in the individual. Where even after recovery, the newly introduced archetypes may still remain part of the individual's psychological makeup. And in that sense, healing doesn't necessarily mean erasing or eliminating these patterns. Rather, it involves creating a more balanced and integrated relationship with them. Next to this, certain archetypes may also be more pronounced or emphasized in our individual psyches due to the cumulative influence of our familial lineage. Think a certain profession being common, where caregivers, mentors, or other influential figures in early life also can contribute to the formation of our psychological patterns as well. These influences can introduce or emphasize certain archetypes in our psyche, create complexes as well, further contributing to the unique composition of our individual unconscious. And regarding the more dominant archetypes within our psyche, one thing I want to highlight is that these are not just archetypes that we just associate with, nor a persona, a social mask or role for the individual. In contrast, dominant archetypes go beyond mere social roles. They, in that sense, shape the core personality of an individual. And these archetypes symbolize innate traits and behaviors that feel natural to the individual, influencing how they navigate the world and relate to themselves and others on a deeper, more authentic level. And some of the archetypes I will go into within this video are the sovereignty goddess, Wotan, and the Koryos pattern, Dionysus, wild nature spirits, the wise old man and wise old woman as well, which for our modern society still mainly reside within the collective shadow, which are the archetypes which are rejected or seen as taboo. Of which for myself, Wotan, the sovereignty goddess, and Dionysus are the three archetypes that happen to be the most important and dominant for myself. So I'm here speaking from experience regarding, the effects of this on, the individual psyche. And these archetypes I also cover in depth within my book, Alchemy of the Psyche. Link in the description, where I go into their Pagan, Indo-European, and Proto-Indo-European form and essence, explaining their different manifestations throughout time and tracing them back to the Neolithic, and with that to the Proto-Indo-European foundations. So if you're interested in that, make sure to check that out. But now coming back to the video. Even though our modern society is not pagan anymore, this does not mean that these archetypes are not present within our cultures, merely relegated to the collective shadow. This is where cultural complexes also play an important role. Cultural complexes can arise as a result of social and cultural factors that impact the expression and integration of archetypal patterns. These cultural complexes can be seen as distorted versions of these archetypal themes that arise due to social or cultural factors such as trauma, environmental factors, or cultural norms and values. And this shapes our current collective and cultural attitude towards these particular archetypes. However, as much as for a particular person, the ability to express the dominant archetype is important for their psychological well-being, this is also true for the collective psyche. If we look at Western civilization within the time frame of the Neolithic to modernity, we can see that the majority of what shaped the Indo-European collective psyche is the Proto-Indo-European foundations and the archetypes connected to that, spanning from 5,000 years ago in the Neolithic to roughly 1,000 years ago in the Middle Ages, as folk beliefs were still strong till then. Hence, the archetypes linked to the Proto-Indo-European foundations have shaped our ancestors and with that our own psyche for a very long time. At least 4,000 years, if not longer. As such, these connected archetypes that also include the sovereignty goddess Wotan and the Koryos pattern next to Dionysus, wild nature spirits, the wise old man and wise old woman, are important aspects of the collective psyche of the Indo-Europeans. And this is similarly the case when it comes to other cultures as well. Native American tribes as much have their own particular archetypes that are more pronounced in their culture, where within Egypt or China they have their own archetypes that are more in the forefront there, which is a natural development within these cultures, and as much is connected to the individuals within the culture and their shared relationship to each other and the relationship that the culture has with the land and environment that they inhabit. Which is why within an Indo-European context, serpents can become withholders of water, where in China, serpents and dragons are the bringers of waters. The change being related to the context of their environment. Droughts being a problem for the Indo-Europeans versus floods for instance, the Chinese. What I then also want to highlight with this is that for all the different cultures, the archetypes that are more pronounced are such due to the long-term adaptations made by very many generations to that particular environment and the connected social relationships both within the tribe and between the tribe and their environment. If we thus would come in with other ideas and start to label certain such archetypes as bad and push them into the collective shadow by demonizing them, we end up disrupting this harmonious balance. Which you can see here, with this example, with this mandala I made for, the Proto-Indo-European culture. This is a mandala for myself that I created as an example of this sense of balance. So to highlight again, if we end up disrupting this harmonious balance that every generation within said culture has always been, trying to reestablish and, rebalance, this has, consequences. And they were doing that throughout these generations because, one's environment also changes over time. Whilst, it's also about keeping the essence of these archetypes alive despite these environmental changes, and the changes within the culture and the times that one is alive. And in that sense, the key being to keep this pattern in its healthy and integrated manifestation that is aligned to the times that the people live in. And as such, imposing external judgments on these archetypes can disrupt this delicate balance and lead to internal conflicts within the culture. And this disruption may affect the psychological well-being of individuals and the collective cohesion of the society. And this influence then also may lead to a sense of cultural alienation, loss of identity, or even psychological distress, as individuals grapple with conflicting external judgments about their deeply rooted symbols. And the demonization of crucial archetypes can further lead to a form of cultural trauma. And this can create a loss of continuity, which can create a void in the collective psyche, impacting the sense of belonging and shared history within the culture, leading to a meaning crisis and belonging crisis. And this can further also lead to internal psychological conflicts, a sense of shame or even self-rejection within that culture, which in turn can fragment the social fabric by fostering divisions and tensions within the community. And with that said, I want to highlight that each culture and individual contributes to the diversity and richness of the human experience through their own unique archetypal expressions. And we need to celebrate and respect this expression. Otherwise, we end up with a loss of the unique insights, wisdom, and perspectives embedded in these different archetypal patterns. They're all part of the same tree, but adapted to the specific land and circumstances of that particular environment over a very long time. And one cannot just, come in and mess with it. And for us, the Proto-Indo-European primal elements form the bedrock of later Indo-European cultures. And I want to first go into the sovereignty goddess, then Dionysus and Wotan, and what they are connected to, before going into different manifestations of the sovereignty goddess and Wotan throughout time. So first, when it comes to the sovereignty goddess. In the Indo-European context, the sovereignty goddess is often associated with the concept of a divine feminine figure who embodies the land, fertility, and the well-being of the community. And her presence is linked to the prosperity of the land and the people's connection to it. And this archetype is intertwined with the notion of a sacred king or a leader whose legitimacy is tied to the harmonious relationship with the sovereignty goddess. The well-being of the land and the people being contingent upon maintaining a balanced and respectful interaction with the natural world. Also having a triple form as maiden, mother, and wise woman when it comes to the sovereignty goddess in some of her forms. Where she further, within the Indo-European framework, is a guardian of the equilibrium between human society and nature, with her role extending, beyond a mere deity. She symbolizes the interconnectedness of the community with the land, the health and prosperity of the people being intricately tied to their harmonious relationship with the natural environment. And within this context, the sovereignty goddess ensures that the balance between people and nature is maintained, emphasizing a sustainable and reciprocal relationship. Where a last thing I want to bring up that is an important factor in certain Indo-European traditions is that she is also associated with compassion and justice. And she also played a role in advocating for marginalized individuals such as outcasts or those on the fringes of society. And the goddess embodies a nurturing and inclusive aspect, guiding the community in welcoming and reintegrating those who have been marginalized or excluded. Next, I want to cover Dionysus. Also going a little bit into Orphic Dionysus as well. Dionysus being the god of wine, ecstasy, and revelry, which has Indo-European roots and is often linked to the celebration of life and the cyclical nature of existence, where in the Orphic tradition, Dionysus takes on a more mystical and spiritual significance, representing the transformative journey of the soul. Now, Yeah, so in the Indo-European context, Dionysus is connected to the vitality of the land and its fertility, with the celebration of Dionysian festivals involving the recognition of the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth, thus reflecting an understanding of the interconnectedness between humanity and the natural world, where the Orphic tradition places emphasis on Dionysus as a figure associated with spiritual transformation and the liberation of the soul. The ecstatic rituals and mysteries associated with Orphic Dionysus, in that sense, involve a deep inner journey and symbolic death and rebirth, reflecting the cyclical and transformative nature of existence, or what Jungians would call individuation, regarding such deep inner journeys. Where finally, when it comes to Wotan and the Koryos pattern, what I can say regarding Wotan is, he's also known as Odin in Norse mythology, and he is a complex deity associated with wisdom, war, and magic. In the Indo-European context, Wotan is often seen as a divine force, representing the pursuit of knowledge, spiritual insight, and the warrior archetype next to the wise old man. Where with the Koryos pattern, this is a term often used in the context of Indo-European initiation rites and male warrior bands, which involves a group of young warriors, Koryos, who undergo transformative rituals, including tests of courage and endurance, where this pattern is linked to the development of martial skills, camaraderie, and a sense of duty. Where Wotan as a deity is also often associated with the Koryos pattern in the context of warrior initiation and the forging of a warrior's identity. The god's pursuit of wisdom and knowledge, aligning with the ideals of the warrior who seeks not only physical prowess but also intellectual and spiritual strength. Finally, the Koryos pattern, as connected to Wotan, also involves symbolic acts of sacrifice and transformation, so a death and a rebirth. In that sense, the warrior undergoes challenges and ordeals, mirroring the archetype of Wotan's own quest for knowledge, self-discovery, and the acceptance of death and rebirth. And these archetypes that I now went into, are connected to the book Alchemy of the Psyche, and these are just, few of these archetypes. And there are many more particular archetypal patterns and archetypes out there, within the Indo-European context, obviously. I'm highlighting these specific ones because they are interconnected. And with that, connect to a larger archetypal pattern as well, which I want to go in still later. But first, when it now comes to both the sovereignty goddess and Wotan throughout time, so they have their original archetypal root, but this over time also branched out into different archetypal expressions of the same theme. For Wotan, examples would be the hunting deity in the later Koryos pattern as its root, with different manifestations being linked to Apollo, the Corybantes, Uranus, Mars, Odin in the Wild Hunt, the Fianna, and King Arthur and his knights. Where with the sovereignty goddess, her earlier prehistoric roots lie in the mistress of the beasts, and in later times manifested in the forms of, for instance, Feronia, Sanya, Diana, Artemis, Leto, Ceres, Epona, De Morgan, and Holda, were eventually with the Koryos pattern the mentor figure that had morphed into Merlin, becoming demonic and being pushed into the collective shadow, when it comes to the later Middle Ages, where Merlin's demonic heritage is, made more severe and more evil by the early French and English medieval writers of his life, who suggest that Merlin was created by demons to be the literal Antichrist. Whereas much Holda or the Arthurian Vivian, Lady of the Lake, became a figure labeled as a witch and connected to witchcraft, similarly pushed into the collective shadow. And these different deities that I mentioned, I cover, like I said, in depth within my book, The Alchemy of the Psyche, when it comes to both the Koryos and Sovereignty Goddess pattern. Where in my History of Consciousness course, I cover in the second fish episode both Merlin and Vivian, if you're interested in wanting to know more about this. And like I said, next to that there are also other archetypes within the collective shadow as well, that also have an Indo-European root, which are interconnected with the previous archetypes. I'll link to the more primal and nature-centric elements connected to both animism and paganism. The first one I want to go into being wild nature spirits. In Indo-European pagan cultures, there's often a deep reverence for nature, spirits, and untamed forces. These archetypes align with the primal and wild aspects of nature that were both feared and respected. You can think here of different nature spirits such as animal spirits, spirits of place such as nymphs, elves, tree spirits, and other such beings, including fauns, for instance. Where Indo-European pagan cultures often also had spiritual leaders, healers, or seers who acted as intermediaries between the human and spiritual realms. Also something that is currently within the collective shadow. These figures facilitated healing, guided transformative experiences, and maintained harmony with the spiritual forces. And they play the important role of mediators between the community, nature, and the spiritual realm, also helping individuals reconnect to the sense of inner balance and harmony both within oneself and with the wider world. Where similarly, herbalists and the wise women were also as an archetype pushed into the collective shadow, and yes, this had many actual real world consequences as well that happened as well, that I do wanna, bring up. But as this is a more archetypal analysis of, what happened, I'm not gonna go too deep into that. But if, you're interested in that, I would recommend, looking into that deeper yourself. But now when it comes to, herbalists and the wise women, well, in Indo-European cultures, there were often individuals, particularly women, known for the knowledge of herbs and healing practices. And these figures played a crucial role in promoting well-being and maintaining the balance of the community, often linked to the sovereignty goddess. Think, for instance, the Volva and Holda. And these women playing an important role in being this bridge between society and nature. To protect nature from human society by establishing sacred groves, for instance, or teach the children of the community about nature and how to act responsible and with respect. Both the herbalists and wise women next to the sovereignty goddess in medieval times were labeled a witch, with which they were demonized and pushed into the collective shadow, like I had said. And with this said, I do want to highlight now again that the reason I'm bringing these archetypes up, the sovereignty goddess, Dionysus, Wotan, and all the others, including the herbalists and wise women, is because these are, like I said, important parts of the Indo-European psyche and have been there for a very, very long time. And as thus created a very long imprint, on our cultures, but not just on our cultures, but on the individuals within said culture as well. which leads me to the next point. The displacement of paganism by Christianity. So yeah, this could have given rise to what in Jungian psychology is called cultural complexes, which are distorted versions of archetypal themes. And these complexes may manifest in the form of unresolved tensions, conflicts, or biases between the pagan archetypes and the dominant Christian narrative. And the current culture war may thus be a continuation of these unresolved complexes, reflecting shifting attitudes towards archetypes and cultural symbols. And we can see this conflict already during the late medieval period in Europe, 1400 to 1500 AD, where there was a shift away from the traditional spiritual and philosophical beliefs that had been prevalent in the previous centuries, mainly focused on pagan folk beliefs next to more individualistic Christianity. And during this time, there was a tension between the growing desire for individuality and self-expression and the ongoing efforts by the church to maintain its authority and control over the masses. So in that sense, in addition to the dominant Christian beliefs, there were also elements of folk religion and paganism that were still practiced by communities. And these traditional beliefs were during this time often discouraged or suppressed. But despite the displacement of pagan practices, these archetypal patterns and symbols persisted in various forms, often relegated to the collective shadow. And the thing is that, sure, it can be pushed into the collective shadow, but they are still part of the collective psyche. And as such, even though the rituals are gone and no one is practicing these things anymore, it still exists. It's still there. And the thing is that, it doesn't go away. And as such, the current culture war may reflect the re-emergence of these archetypes as they strive for recognition and integration within the evolving cultural landscape. I do want to say, though, that the specific ideologies are responses to the times and historical circumstances as much as a response partially born out of the fact that certain archetypes and archetypal patterns that are connected to real human behaviors were relegated to the collective shadow. As such, certain elements are missing, which can, for instance, lead to the marginalization of certain people or also to the mistreating of nature, just to name a few examples. So the cultural framework itself can lead to the exclusion of marginalized elements associated with the collective shadow, which are not just parts of the culture in that sense that are, repressed, of the old pagan culture, but also directly tie into qualities within ourselves as well. Then now when it comes to these different archetypes that we talked about, specifically the sovereignty goddess Dionysus and Wotan in the Koryos pattern, and the current cultural framework. So when it comes to the sovereignty goddess, well, the emphasis on a harmonious relationship with nature as embodied by the sovereignty goddess contradicts the prevailing Western cultural attitudes that historically prioritize human dominance over nature. And as such, the archetype challenges the exploitative relationship with the environment that has led to ecological crises, where next to that, the sovereignty goddess archetype challenges traditional patriarchal structures by embodying feminine power and advocating for marginalized individuals. And this challenges societal norms that historically suppressed feminine qualities and limited the roles of women and other marginalized groups. Where on the other hand, with the Wotan and Koryos pattern, well, when it comes to the cultural framework, Wotan's association with wisdom and the pursuit of knowledge challenges a culture that may prioritize material success and technological advancement over intellectual and spiritual growth, where the Koryos pattern, with its emphasis on initiation and rites of passage, contrasts with a society that often neglects such transformative experiences. Where finally, the warrior archetype, symbolized by both Wotan and the Koryos pattern, challenges the modern aversion to being assertive, where the symbolic acts of sacrifice and transformation may be at odds with a society that often values safety and comfort over facing challenges and embracing personal growth through adversity. Then finally, regarding Dionysus, well, the Dionysian celebration of life and the transformative journey of the soul challenges Western cultural values that may prioritize rationality and control over the acceptance of chaos and the irrational. Dionysus represents the ecstasy and liberation that may be seen as threatening to established social orders, where the Orphic Dionysus, with its emphasis on spiritual transformation and mystical experiences, challenges a culture that tends to prioritize materialism and a reductionist view of reality. The archetype confronts a purely materialistic worldview and the neglect of spiritual dimensions. And as such, any new ideology that arises to address this would thus also be unconsciously influenced by said archetype, meaning that the ideologies and movements involved in the culture war could be really seen as responses to the archetypal imbalance in the collective psyche, where they can unconsciously touch upon the relevant archetypes that are within the collective shadow of that particular culture, meaning, in this case, Western culture. And we can, as individuals, have indeed our own judgments regarding these different movements. It is easy to judge these different ideologies, and sure, there's good and bad with everything. Yet, what remains is that we cannot simply ignore what they point towards, even if we might dislike the ideology itself. So what I want to highlight is that as long as these remain within the collective shadow of the culture or larger aspects of the culture, as they do exist on the fringes, these larger aspects of the culture might demonize them as something to try to push them back into the collective shadow. Now, next I also want to go into some possible connections between the archetypes of the sovereignty goddess, Wotan, and Dionysus, and their potential linked modern phenomena. And, do keep in mind that more archetypes can be involved, and there are also modern real world and historical factors that are important in shaping these movements. So there's much more nuance involved than what I'm able to convey in this particular video. I would have to, go much deeper into these particular movements, even though I've done so myself. It would make this video very long, so I'm gonna keep it for this one much shorter. But the key factor in this is that these archetypal associations highlight the repressed themes that are touched upon by, those movements. Then now, when it comes to the sovereignty goddess, the associated themes could be potentially feminism, Wicca, and environmentalism, to name a few examples. There can be many more examples that could come to mind, for oneself, but these are just a few that I want to touch upon. There are obviously being different flavors and, nuances there within these different movements as well. So do keep that in mind. But when it comes to, for instance, feminism, the sovereignty goddess archetype is deeply intertwined with themes of femininity and empowerment. And in the context of feminism, this archetype aligns with the pursuit of women's rights, gender equality, and the empowerment of women in various aspects of life, including social, political, and economic spheres. The sovereignty goddess originally also having power over the social order, where, like we said before, the sovereignty goddess is also linked to compassion and justice, advocating for marginalized individuals. And I think for a lot of people that by now is starting to sound awfully familiar, because it aligns with feminist principles emphasizing inclusivity, and also in that sense, like the goddess symbolizes the welcoming and reintegrating of marginalized or outcast individuals as well. Reinforcing themes of what we would call in the modern sense social justice. Or she also manifests, for instance, within Wicca and nature-based spirituality as well, regarding the sovereignty goddess, as she is linked to nature and the land. Where in Wicca and nature-based spirituality, this archetype may be associated with reverence for the natural world, earth-centered rituals, and the acknowledgement of the divine feminine in the cycles of nature. Where Wiccan practices in particular often honor the sacredness of the land and its connection to the goddess. Where the emphasis on nature within the sovereignty goddess archetype also aligns with environmentalist themes. This includes advocating for the protection of the environment, sustainable practices, and recognizing the interdependence between humanity and the natural world. Where the goddess symbolizes the call to safeguard the earth's vitality and maintain ecological harmony. What I do want to mention though is that in the original pagan sense, when we're talking, about the sovereignty goddess, a lot of these themes are all interconnected to the same being, and there's less of division between these different elements. But those kind of elements do come together in some sense as well within, these different examples that I talked about. So there's that too. Where with Dionysus, associated themes could be, for instance, hippies, the New Age, ecological consciousness and sustainability, the psychedelic renaissance and inner exploration, festivals, artistic expression, and creative movements. So when it comes to hippies and the New Age, the emphasis on spiritual transformation and inner exploration within the Orphic tradition aligns with the hippie and New Age focus on spiritual journeys, self-discovery, and seeking higher states of consciousness through various practices, including meditation and psychedelics. Where the communal aspects of Dionysian festivals find echoes in the hippie movement's embrace of communal living, shared resources, and a countercultural rejection of mainstream societal norms. Both express a desire for a more communal, inclusive way of life. Where Dionysus' connection to nature and vitality aligns with contemporary themes of ecological consciousness and sustainability, with the celebration of the Earth's fertility and interconnectedness finding resonance in environmental movements advocating for a harmonious relationship with the planet. where the mystical and spiritual aspects of Dionysus, especially in the Orphic tradition, could be associated with the contemporary resurgence of interest in psychedelics for inner exploration, consciousness expansion, and spiritual experiences. Where finally, Dionysian festivals involved communal celebrations, and in a modern context, themes of festivals, cultural celebrations, and communal gatherings may be linked to the archetype as well, emphasizing shared experiences and the joy of coming together. Where Dionysus' association with revelry and ecstasy could also be linked to artistic expression and creative movements. And these themes align with the pursuit of artistic passion, dance, music, and other forms of creative expression as a means of celebrating life. Where we finally have the Wotan and Koryos pattern, with the associated themes being the men's movement, the mythopoetic movement, and on the more extreme end, the alt-right. The archetypes of Wotan and the Koryos pattern are linked to themes of masculinity, identity, and tribalism. And in the men's movement, these archetypes resonate with the exploration of contemporary masculinity, self-discovery, and the development of a positive and authentic male identity. The movement often seeking to address challenges and expectations faced by men in society. With the mythopoetic movement being inspired by Jungian psychology and mythic themes, also exploring the archetypal dimensions of masculinity as well. And Wotan and the Koryos pattern here align with the movement's emphasis on reconnecting with ancient myths and archetypes to foster personal and collective growth. And this may involve ritual, storytelling, and self-exploration rooted in masculine archetypal symbols, which very strongly resonates with the Koryos pattern as well, which I go deeper into within my book Alchemy of the Psyche. But now to the alt-right on a more extreme end. They often emphasize identity politics, tribalism, and a sense of belonging among a specific group, which resonates partly with the Koryos pattern. And this may involve a focus on shared ancestry, cultural heritage, and a commitment to a collective identity. Similar to its shadow manifestation before regarding World War II and Nazi Germany, which I also go into within my book as well. Which is the destructive side of this Wotan and Koryos pattern, where the mythopoetic movement, for instance, approaches this from a more integrated perspective. But even though these movements within Western society are born out of the real world socio, cultural, and historical situations that shape them, on a deeper archetypal level, they touch upon these very same archetypal patterns that were part of the collective psyche of the Indo-European people. There having been a continual struggle between these patterns that had been pushed into the collective shadow as taboo and to be avoided, and the collective consciousness of society as a whole. So the dominant cultural framework of the time that had tried to repress these archetypal patterns. However, when it comes to archetypes, it is when we repress them that they can emerge in their unintegrated shadow form, which can lead to destructive outcomes. Next to this, people who happen to authentically align with these archetypal qualities suffer from this repression into the collective shadow as well. Their well-being, and with that the collective well-being of society, gets affected by it, as repression of vital archetypal patterns breeds resentment and resistance. And I hope that with this video it becomes clear what the consequences are of trying to deny archetypes both within a culture and individuals from being expressed in a healthy and integrated manner. So a creative manner instead of a destructive one. It is what not only causes a profound inner conflict between the individual authentic self and the societal norms and expectations, but also on a much larger scale leads to a similar inner conflict within the collective psyche. What we in our modern terms would call a culture war. So I hope that this gives you a moment to pause and think about this, to realize that these archetypes are not just abstract patterns disconnected from life and as such individuals, but are deeply intertwined with it, with life and people, and as such important for not only their well-being but the well-being of the whole. When it now comes to the culture war itself, one phenomena that I go into within my book, The Alchemy of the Psyche, is the mechanism of scapegoating. These very same parts of the collective shadow we talked about earlier at the same time get projected outwardly onto what the group sees as other. Modern scapegoating thus involves identifying individuals or groups as bearers of evil or wrongdoing, blaming them and expelling them from the community to instill a sense of guiltlessness among the remaining members, with the scapegoat becoming a target for blame, criticism, and negative projections, disrupting their sense of self and contributing to a distorted self-image. The different aspects of the scapegoat complex that is tied to this being the accuser, victim, wanderer, and redeemer. The wanderer being burdened with collective guilt and chosen as the carrier of the collective shadow. As the Jungian analyst Sylvia Brinton Pereira pointed out in her book about the scapegoat complex, this distorted version of the complex is a widespread pathology within not only Western culture but other cultures as well. Where in my book I also go into the role that the Koryos, Wotan, the sovereignty goddess, and Dionysus play within this context. Wotan often playing the part of archetypal wanderer, where the Koryos is living outside of the norms of society, tapping into the needed assertiveness and transformation needed to break free of this type of pattern, where the sovereignty goddess and Dionysus are linked to the Redeemer in a more ancient sense, giving people a way out of these dynamics and back into society as true individuals, meaning authentic. Yet, within our current Western culture, these different aspects have been cast into the collective shadow, where they are clashing against each other. When looking at the more dangerous shadow manifestation of these patterns now, which can manifest itself on the more radical ends of the spectrum, please know that the radical elements within any movement represents a subset and does not capture the full spectrum of beliefs within those movements. So be aware that this, what I'm now gonna talk about, does not apply to all within the movements and only applies to the more extreme manifestations. But I do feel like pointing these things out regarding the shadow form, as this is as much important to know as the original pattern, which I explain in depth within my book. The Koryos pattern in its shadow form can become exclusionary, emphasizing a tribalistic and militaristic mindset, and due to individuals still operating under the influence of the scapegoat complex, the primal aspects can also then become projected onto the other, where with the sovereignty goddess in the shadow form, she can turn resentful of society and the treatment of nature and those marginalized by society. So instead of empowering the individual, which is her more healthy role, she could become a force that seeks to tear down what is seen as more powerful. where similarly when unconscious of it, shadow dynamics can also take place. This could manifest as a desire for revenge or a rebellion against established structures. And this rebellion may be fueled by a sense of frustration and a perceived need to tear down what is seen as oppressive. Wherein both these patterns would, due to this conflicting shadow nature, clash with each other for obvious reasons. For example, those embodying the shadow aspects of the Koryos pattern may see the sovereignty goddess archetype as weak, resentful, and a danger to tradition. On the other hand, those embodying the shadow aspects of the sovereignty goddess may view the Koryos pattern as aggressive, oppressive, and a symbol of traditional structures that need to be dismantled for progress. These aspects, however, when we put them together in a healthy form, as they are also depicted here in this particular slide, create this path towards liberation of this cycle of scapegoating and shadow projection instead, where they are currently fragmented in the psyche of our collective consciousness. So in that sense, looking at the original essence of it, like I said, that I go into my book Alchemy of the Psyche, which showed that these parts are actually interconnected, and to understand this, how this pattern in the ancient sense worked, is there a way out of this whole mess? And in that sense, the Koryos pattern, Wotan, and the sovereignty goddess are part of the same archetypal pattern. So again, if you want to know more about this, I highly suggest to check out my book Alchemy of the Psyche. And with that said, I hope that you learned something from this video. Make sure to like and subscribe and leave me a comment. And maybe see you next time. Okay, bye bye.